what happened during the pandemic was of such an order of wrongness, it would be criminal to not seek to understand, address it, and look for accountability. And what we can see, the censorship goes far beyond anti-vax. People should be behind bars for it, in my view.
Yeah. I'm Jasmine Birtles, and today I'm here with the marvellous, hard-working Molly Kingsley, who set up UsForThem UK, the charity that particularly looks after children and has been fighting for the rights of children, particularly against lockdown and the various other issues that have come through the COVID years and beyond. Molly, hello there.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on.
Molly, you sent me a tweet by Rupert Lowe, the Reform candidate, which went through so many of the evils of the COVID years and pointed out that so many of them have not been addressed. What was it that you felt when you saw this tweet, which drops a whole load of truth bombs, let's be honest?
It does drop a whole load of truth bombs, and actually, I wonder whether it would be worth I'm just getting it in front of me so I can sort of go through those truth bombs. But Rupert, so this is interesting because this is Rupert Lowe. He's an MP for the Reform Party, and of course, one of the things that having reform in Parliament means is finally we have politicians who weren't part of the establishment at the time of the pandemic. And I think maybe to frame this, so people talk about the pandemic period and the COVID period as just, another period of government that, mistakes were made, but let's move on. And obviously, no one in any way implicated in the period, which is most people, by the way, want anything to do with it. And reform come along, and Rupert just put out this tweet just last night, I think it was, just saying, actually forget all the scandals we've got going on with Keir Starmer and Lord Ali and the flat and the wardrobe. Yeah, all of that does matter. And yes, it stinks. And no, it's not great, particularly for a prime minister that, had a big few paragraphs about ethics and integrity in the Labour manifesto, obviously. But actually, all of that pales into comparison compared to what happened during the pandemic period. And Rupert then lists the many, and he uses the word actually, the wicked things that were done to us. And I think it is a very accurate reflection. And, everything from these unevidenced, indiscriminate interventions, lockdown, school closures, to testing, to, of course, the vaccine program. And, the vaccine program that was full of propaganda. Propaganda is another word for lies, manipulations, deceits, non-disclosures. And it's a subject very close to my heart because it is, it is very much what UsForThem is about now. So, as I'm sure, some of your listeners and viewers will know, we started as really a single issue campaign during school closures. And, that as it became quite how horrific the pandemic response was for children, but also for all of us, really, and for, the kind of future we want to leave to our kids. What was a single issue morphed into many campaigns. And I think coming out of that period, we are as concerned about, freedom, democracy, accountability, as about purely children specific matters. But I would caveat that by saying everything is seen through what is the society we are creating for our kids. Like, how does this better kids and their futures? Like, what kind of future are we going to leave for them? And I just think what happened during the pandemic was of such an order of wrongness, it would be criminal to not seek to understand, address it, and look for accountability for it.
Yeah, and as you say, there are many people who were very much part of it, even if they weren't in government. There's a whole load of people that were plugging the lies, etc., who really don't want to look at it. They really do, as you say, they want to just sort of cover it over, go, oh, well, that's the past. We'll just move, let's move forward. It's always a good way to say it, let's move forward. let's just cover it over. But you've brought out a report which looks at a whole load of issues, I think, to do with lockdowns and their effect on children.
Yeah, I mean, actually, this was so it started as a report and it ended up as a book, and it's accountability deficit, and it's actually we're updating it at the moment actually to tie in with. Actually, I better not say more than that. It doesn't happen. But the current edition is was from last Christmas, actually, so about 6 months ago. And I am a lawyer by training, and one of my co-authors is also my husband, Ben, and he is a lawyer, quite a senior lawyer. And we sat down and we just thought, no, I'm sorry, like, we're not talking about mistakes, was my instinct here. These were not policy mistakes. It seems, even before we'd written what became the book, it seemed to us as lawyers, and from what we had learned from 4 years of campaigning, and actually, I should say one of the things that Us for Them has done is an awful lot of strategic litigation, and through that we have forced disclosures out. So to give you just a couple of examples of that, we forced disclosures out about the masking of children, and those disclosures proved that there had been no harm assessment. Now, that in itself, you're taking a decision to mask school children for 6, 7, 8 hours a day. This wasn't in public transport, this was in classrooms. There, at the time that decision was made, were many known harms, some physical harms of masking children, and the benefits were negligible at best. And, just that one issue, and obviously it's one, as Rupert said, of so many, that one single issue, in my view, evidences something that approaches a criminal standard of recklessness. So, and that is, I will say, the masking of children in classrooms was, in my opinion, my legally informed opinion, nowhere near the worst or most egregious thing we are talking about in the pandemic. I'm sure we can all think of other things. So in my view, we're looking here at acts which aren't mistakes. They are, in the very best case, criminally reckless, I would say. And they affected, in some cases, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of us. Like, this is a very serious order act. And we started writing this book, and, in some cases forensically went through meeting minutes, records we weren't aware of, and it just were really appalled by some of the things we found.
What things particularly were a surprise as well as being appalling?
Yeah, so okay, I'll give you maybe just a couple of sort of headlines. So I think one was the extent of the censorship operation. So, we know, and again, actually, this was a result of freedom of information at requests that I and others submitted. And obviously we had, the papers made this big thing about the counter disinformation unit. That was big news story. I can't, what, a year, maybe more than that ago now. And it was many of the lockdown dissidents were impacted by that, and it turned out that this counter disinformation unit had been stood up to, it would say monitor narratives. It wasn't monitoring, it was we think censoring, it was taking down content. And I think when you look at what has been said publicly and reported about that, it strikes me that we only know a tiny fraction of the scale of that censorship operation. And in the press have been quite nebulous in their reporting of it. They talk about the censorship of, lockdown dissidents or anti-lockdown campaigners. Now, I'm sure there was some of that, but it seems from what we can see and going through witness statements of people involved, select committee hearings where the CDU was discussed, it seems very much that unit were focused in particular on anti-vaccine narratives. And this is, I think, where it all gets quite sinister. Not only what you and I might consider pure anti-vaccine content. Now, I think we might say that in itself shouldn't be censored. But, I can more easily understand how what one might term pure anti-vax, don't get a vaccine, it's awful, or, even though of course that's a matter of opinion. And it looks like views on that, were many of the people saying, get it, it's brilliant, it's safe and effective, were just totally wrong. But, that's a separate issue. The thing that is really, I think, sinister about it is, from what we can see, the censorship goes far beyond anti-vax information, and it included censorship of the pharmaceutical industry. So CDU themselves have said, it wasn't only anti-vax information, it was information about the safety, relative safety of the vaccines. It was information about the fact that the approvals process had been accelerated. They were monitoring, and we assume flagging. And it was people who talked about links between the pharmaceutical industry and the vaccine. And you kind of think, what? So we're not allowed to say that, the pharmaceutical industry has this huge influence on public policy. Well, according to that basis, whole select committees, there was a select committee about 20 years ago on exactly that. Like, what would that be censored from public discourse? Yeah. And I think, sorry, that's quite a detailed explanation. I'll be quicker with my next one. But I think it just gives a feel for the idea that there's really been no discussion about the extent of this censorship operation, and in some ways it's quite totalitarian nature. I mean, you can't say that criticism of an entire industry is out of bounds. That is insane. It is absolutely insane. Yet that, if you read the witness statements, and this is all in the book, if you read the witness statements given by key people from the counter disinformation unit, that is the implication. The second one, I'm going to keep this really short. So I wonder how many of your viewers knew that the government had an ethics committee. So there was an ethics committee. It was called the Moral and Advisory Ethic. It was called the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, and it was set up just before the pandemic, and its remit included advising on ethical aspects of the pandemic policy. It was initially meant for a 3-year term. And this is a whole chapter in the book, so I'm just going to cut it very short, but to cut a quite convoluted and really sinister story short, a few months into the pandemic, that committee started giving negative advice about the government's handling of the pandemic. So it gave negative advice about lockdowns, particularly the impact on the young, subject obviously close to, my heart and Us for Them's heart. And it also started giving really negative advice on COVID passports. It said, this was December 2020, it said these are, potentially anti-human rights. They're going to destroy trust in public health. And there's all kinds of ethical implications that haven't been thought about. When that was just before Christmas break, the committee reconvened after the Christmas break, and whereas they had been meeting weekly before then, it is very noticeable that they were effectively increasingly sidelined. So Chris Whitty, after MEAG, this group, had given this very negative advice about COVID passports, the group coincidentally then break, it looks like, from the minutes for a Christmas holiday. And after the Christmas break, there's a note, and I'm just reading out what it says in the minutes here. It says it looks like the chair of the group had met with Chris Whitty. Chris Whitty, of course, was the chief medical officer at the time, and the meeting records, and I'm quoting, that the CMO valued the presence of the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group and the ability to understand complexities, however, counselled against producing documentation that offered recommendations given the political aspect of decision making. And you're just like,
shut up, basically. Just
don't write things down. Don't write things down, so there's no record of it. And we don't want, that is the implication. And I should say that we went to Chris Whitty and DHSCs who are, to ask for comment. We didn't receive a reply. So, that's what's written. And that, as lawyers, that was the first moment at which we just thought that does not look right for, a serious group, a committee at the very heart of government advising on ethics. I mean, like, without ethics, we're all barbarians, aren't we? Anyway, it gets worse because the group continue to try and do what they can to give ethical input, and over a 6-month period are gradually, as I said, sidelined until they are eventually dismissed altogether. And they try, I think many of us would say that the most shocking decision of the whole pandemic, I would certainly say, was the rollout of the vaccine to children. I think Rupert mentions that, so he calls it disgraceful. It was absolutely disgraceful,
Yeah.
and I think that is a word as can be said for it. I mean, people should be behind bars for it, in my view.
Yeah.
And the MEAG, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, had said, we think we should be advising, I'm paraphrasing, but we think we should be advising on this. They had tried to give advice. That advice was hostile. And long story short, it looks from the minutes like ministers and the Department for Health had a heads up of that advice about to be given, and the group was shut down. And MEAG's term, and it was a little bit more complicated than that, but if you read the chronology, it is very clear that after that point, MEAG gave no more input on pandemic policies. And although there were a couple more meetings, they were sent off on complete tangents, nothing to do with the pandemic at the time that the only story in the newspapers was the pandemic. I think they were asked to look about, AI imaging and virginity testing ethical implications. It makes no sense.
No.
And the group were disbanded a year before their term. And, the summary is there was an ethics committee. It was closed down when it started giving negative advice on pandemic policy. And I just think, for me, that is, as a lawyer and as a human being, actually,
Yeah.
that is just such, and, as a Jew, actually, I feel very strongly that ethics matter, and that all recent history of my grandparents indicates what happens when we think ethics are discardable. And I just am so angry,
Yeah.
Jasmine, I can't, there is not a minute almost, or at least not a day that goes by when I don't think we have to get these people for what they did.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is what I'm just thinking as you're talking. I mean, as we've said, it's being swept under the carpet. There are young people dying, and it's like, oh, that's a shame, isn't it? And we have a huge number of excess deaths, which in a year or so will not be seen as excess deaths because, you'll be looking at the last 5 years and it'll be okay. And you think, well, as you say, nobody's being put behind bars, nobody's being questioned even, nobody's being grilled. What can we do? What are you doing, and what can we do to forward this somehow before it gets completely buried?
So I'm going to be a bit careful about what I say publicly, because I genuinely and honestly do feel committed to fighting for accountability, meaningful accountability for this for the rest of my life. And, I believe the people that were intimately involved as the architects and the executioners of these, I believe atrocity is the right word. I believe they will know the order of magnitude of what they have done, and potentially what that means. My view is, as a collective, and we had a bit of a conversation, didn't we, about before we offline, about one of the really amazing things for this period is there are a lot of us who feel this way, and we are increasingly coming together. But I think as a collective we find a stepping stone. We need evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Oh, and it is there. When you look at what's happening in America now, particularly with, I don't know if you've seen the Kansas Pfizer litigation.
Yes, marvelous.
Yeah, marvelous. Like, there is increasing litigation happening that is fleshing out that what has happened is
Criminal.
It's criminal, which is not to say that you have a case that you can stand up, with all the elements, like, or indeed that there are any criminals at this point. We seem to have a crime with, no criminals. But anyway, I think you need ideally a few criminal proceedings brought,
Mm.
you to work out the right target,
Mm.
and then I think you can have a sensible conversation about what happens to everyone who was involved. And there'll be different layers of
Mm.
complicity.
Mm.
There's many, unfortunately, it's a very sad thing. Many people have been made co-conspirators because through just, either through having roles in media and
Mhm.
cheering it on,
Mhm.
or just silence,
Mm.
actually. And of course, the doctors and many in the medical profession are implicated. And but my view is there has to be accountability, because I don't see how we can call ourselves human. I don't see how we can let ourselves look past at something this wrong. And I think most of our politicians would agree with that. Obviously, we had Keir Starmer just at his conference speech. He's talking about this Hillsborough law, this duty of candor to ensure that public officials are, honest in public inquiries. Well, that's literally meaningless rubbish if you're not going to act on these kind of wrongs as they happen. Like, we're still in a period now where something could be done about it.
Yes, exactly. And what I'm wondering is, now for you and your husband, you are lawyers, you're doing wonderful work, and you're able to do that. For other people who are not lawyers, not doctors, not in the media, what can individuals do to help you and to help the cause and open things up finally?
I think that's a really good question, actually. And I think just not stop talking about it is the first thing. I think, because occasionally you think, like, I have so many days where I think, am I in a lunatic asylum of one here? Like, is it just me that feels like this? And actually, when I saw Rupert's tweet, I was like, no, at least there's someone else. And actually, that looks like
Yeah.
it's going quite viral. And I think there's a lot of us. And I ultimately, the need for accountability. I mean, it might be a smaller group that works out what that looks like and how it happens, whether it's a national or international effort.
Mm.
But there will be a moment, whether it's in a year, 5 years, 50 years, it might be after our lifetimes, Jasmine, I don't know. There will
Mm.
be a moment when, to make that happen, that is going to be driven by the people.
Yes, yes. So,
Uh,
so speaking the truth, just speaking the truth to friends. I mean, and I have friends who have taken the vaccine who don't want to talk about it at all. They don't want to hear. Understandably, I mean, to be honest, if I'd taken it, I would be worried now. And so
yeah,
I
I
think
know.
there is a lot of that, but we have to speak about whatever people be willing to speak. If they're not willing to speak about that, at least let's talk about the lockdown and the lockdown harms and how that should never happen. How did it happen? How did we let it happen?
And I think that's right. And I think, like I said at the beginning, I don't actually think you have to go to the vaccine to find criminal order acts. Like, in my view, the standard of under English law, English law, it's not just intentional wrongdoing. It is, as a very general rule, criminal recklessness.
Yeah,
That is,
yeah,
gross recklessness, called that, where there is foreseeable harm. Well, that is criminal.
yeah.
And I think there's lots of that outside of the vaccine rollout. I guess what I would say, because I know it's upsetting, actually, because you see people who are injured, in some cases have died. I mean, I think I probably know 4 or 5 people now who may have been directly affected, and of those, 3 are very open about it.
Mm, mm,
There's
mm.
other people, though, I'm sure we all have this in our networks, who've, died suddenly. And who knows, it may be a complete coincidence. But when you have healthy people dropping down of heart attacks, well, I don't really remember that before
No,
this.
I don't. Not in their 20s and 30s,
No,
certainly.
no.
Just yeah, and yet the media is like, la la la, that's a shame.
And this is death. And this is what gets me in, again, from a kind of parent point of view. I mean, obviously, there's the children, which is a whole different
Mm,
level
mm.
of horror. But the parents, this is young, fit parents. Like, children need fit, healthy parents.
Yeah.
But I think, I guess, ultimately, however difficult the conversation, you'd hope that people would want to have it for the people that have been injured. But I agree, it's hard. Like, often you have these conversations and, have you thought about this? And you get closed down. Don't be ridiculous.
Yeah,
Of course, there's no link.
yeah.
And it's a bit like on a more macro level, it's exactly actually what you said about the reports into the NHS. So we've had Wes Streeting just yesterday again talking about, oh, this huge disability burden to the NHS. And we had the Darzi report, we had the IPPR report last week, and all talking about sick man Britain. And actually the IPPR report, which is one of these policy think tanks, was really interesting because it had a graph in it that literally pinpointed the rising disability on one of the metrics. I think the metric was people that had spent more than 4 hours in hospital. So, I guess that's trying to flush out people with more serious complaint. And that metric had, it had sort of gone like this during 2020. In April 21, it's up the chart. And this wasn't mentioned in the report. The report, it turns out, it's all over the headlines last week. The report, when I looked back at it, was sponsored by, you couldn't make this up, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Johnson Johnson.
How extraordinary, and extraordinarily they're exonerated in it. As you say, you couldn't make it up. Now, your book, obviously, we will put a link below this so that people can get your book. And UsForThem, it's a registered charity, isn't it? So people can support it.
Yeah, they can. We're not actually a registered charity.
Right.
We do too much political work to be, but yeah, we're a company, so people can support. You can donate. There's a donate button, and we always appreciate that because we try not to pay ourselves, but it's been 4 years. We do have mortgages to pay, and they're just running costs of the business as well.
Yes, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Molly. It's really, really helpful. Keep on with what you're doing, and I think we will definitely have you on again so that we can see
Thank
what the
you.
progress has been and how we can make it right.